All right, well, good morning. First off, Blush, thank you for the introduction. I think my talk is over. I'll just stop now. No, that was great. So let me give you guys a quick intro. Just a real quick second about me, and then we'll really get to why we're here. I've been doing this work for about 20 years, focusing in primarily on threat hunting methodology, spending an awful lot of time doing that kind of work. Current job title, not that it matters. I lead a team like Blage said. I'm chief of research in a pretty large organization. And you can find me online at that Twitter handle as mentioned here. So why are we here today? We're here today because since our youth, we've been taught that blue and red are against each other. This is Rock'em Sock'em Robots, if you're not familiar. Since early childhood, maybe it's contrasting colors, the reasoning, but really what it ends up being is that it becomes a fight against good and evil, red versus blue. And throughout our various episodes, we learn that we end up chopping each other's limbs off quite a bit. Early days, your defender on top might lose his hand, goes back, retools, skills up, and then comes back and fights off the penultimate bad guy and ends up chopping his hand off, strangely enough. And we go back and forth through this over time. So today what I really want to focus in on is taking this type of story and challenging your perspective. So we collectively view the world through a series of what amounts to maybe a straw, very narrow lens. And you're probably looking at this, gosh, yeah, that's some really nice jewelry. But really, if you widen your perspective, you see something entirely different. And yeah, that's exactly what it appears to be. And if you didn't notice it, check out this guy right here. He looks super uncomfortable being in that position. And so that's that moment of recognition that some people have when you change their perspective. So perspective as it relates to our world today is really centering around two things. One, I have to wield both a red and a blue team effectively to defend an environment. But in order for them to work together, we actually have to put down our proverbial swords and learn to complement one another. A quick revisit of a couple of concepts that were introduced a couple of years ago here. I call this Mao E-Guerrilla and some hunter principles. On the left in that chart, you'll see typical defender characteristics and some form of typical attacker characteristics when an attack group comes in. You can notice the disparity between the two right off, even in just the typical organizational size, but down through the details, you see very, very different approaches to how they deal with problems. And the takeaway here is really that a targeted organization has a series of advantages that they need to learn how to use and exercise their capabilities and strengths to defend themselves. And it's done through switching constantly between two mindsets. This is where red and blue come together. Offensive mindset really centers around aggressive defense in the form of diminishing an adversary's ability to operate independently in your environment, down to the point where you can make it impossible for them to operate in your environment. And defensively, you really want to exercise a learning organization methodology, learning from every attack, and then leveraging that to your advantage in the form of environmental changes. So you really want to look at every attempt that comes to you as a form of free intelligence that you need to learn how to translate into some form of advantage. One of the ways that we do this is by applying a target-centric methodology. So we can set a target to be any number of things. Maybe it's a threat actor, maybe it's a piece of technology or an asset or a series of controls that you need to go and evaluate. And you always start with a customer in this environment. So you work it through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, working through needs and information gathering, collection, series of analysis and synthesis steps, and bringing back some form of actionable intelligence to your customer who ultimately needs to decide whether or not to take that action. And as we evaluate this target-centric methodology, you can evaluate that as two separate networks, my network and their network, but who are they? Right? So we're going to spend some time talking about they. Some folks might recognize some of these things. Some might disagree, but that's okay. That's why this is called the discourse. So let's talk about a specific series of threats or threat actors. What actually drives them, right? How do we begin to understand and unpack who they are? We start with the arrow model here. We're talking about China for a second. China, in a national policy level, will set out some form of objectives to leap ahead, to otherwise leap over their competitors and replace them in a given environment, in their own environment for that matter. So they follow what's described as an introduction, assimilation, secondary innovation process, or re-innovation, or thusly stated as the leap ahead methodology. So they'll bring in new technology through a variety of means, introduce that into their environment, assimilate that, bring that into their manufacturing, reverse engineering processes, looking to localize the skill sets and actually increase indigenous capabilities. From there, they take the building blocks and they add on. And after the add-on is complete, or at least to a stage of completion, you'll see them start to branch outward and project out into the world in a compete and replace stage. And finally, to a point where they are ready to leap ahead of their competition. And at that point, you start to see a reduction in investment by foreign companies. And so as you walk that down the left-hand side here, you start to observe what the policies are, maybe multi-year plans. People like to talk about the 13th five-year plan. There are multiple multi-year plans that are in play, not just any one. But really what those do is activate needs or create opportunities for this larger middle section where you see state-owned enterprises, private companies, universities, a range of investments occur. Even global events begin to trigger activity sets. And even a need stated that's identified through indigenous capability gaps. And that is really what begins to lead into what we see as intelligence operations and what most of us are familiar with as APT activity. But they're not all bad. That's that bottom graph for you. There's a spectrum of threat, ranging from what we consider to be more or less on the bad side, inherently bad to us or evil to us, and the average citizen more to the right-hand side. The difficulty with this threat spectrum and this threat grouping is the ability and the wanton use of intelligence services to satisfy the needs of the state and industry. And so we offer a framework of what this espionage, what framework of espionage can look like for these threat actors. So one, you see the intelligence services for state-supported industrial development. That's intel for industry. You see intel for military, which is maybe more traditional, what you would expect between nations. You see government-sponsored non-intelligence, so maybe civilian for state-supported industry, maybe an S&T, science and technology organization. You see the companies themselves engaging in this behavior or leveraging the operators for this. And then finally, you end up with the individual. That individual might be more or less categorized as entrepreneurial, going into business for themselves, maybe looking to sell some of those secrets that they've taken to some of these other actor sets up above. So let me give you another frame of reference. We call this the innovation bathtub. When you look at what amounts to a joint operation or joint development unit, you'll see that this mimics what a company might go through when they go ahead and release a new product into the world. There's early research. It branches out into use of universities, labs, centers, even contractors get pieces of the work. And below the line is really what you call below the point of visibility for most folks, where that information technology all starts to come together in the form of actual technology development or product development. And it goes through a series of phases, and eventually it comes out the other end in the form of operational usage and or commercial sales. So what happens when we put a threat into that bathtub? We change some of that language around. We recognize a couple of things. In the upper right-hand quadrant, this is where we all typically live. in operational use. We are at the tail end of the bathtub. In the bottom left, that's really more difficult to see. We don't typically get visibility down in that realm. There's communication, there's planning, there's all sorts of activities that occur. And then there's the darker shaded orange blocks, which are not impossible to see into, but it takes a very specific focus if you want to engage in that. And so what I leave you with in this regard is it's really a matter of your investment of time and whether or not you see the value in investigating each of these. So let's start to make this a little bit real, if possible here, with a fictitious threat group. This threat group is what we might all consider an actor set, or an activity group, depending on which frame of reference you use for modeling threat actors. There's a set of operators in an operational pattern here. They report into a lead operator. Maybe they report up into command and control, and there's a separate development group, something to that effect. And they exhibit some form of these TTPs capabilities, and they leverage them to have an effect on a target. The only thing about this threat group is, and we're going to get into a gray space in the intelligence world. A lot of folks would disagree that, or posit rather, that knowing who doesn't always matter. And for the most part, if you stay and live within this realm, it's absolutely true. But we're going to unpack some of these threat groups. So in the past 2 years, there have been a number of indictments by the United States Department of Justice. Really fascinating if you haven't read them. There's a couple out there. You can Google it, Department of Justice China, espionage, something to that effect, and you will find these. But what we find is a series of actors that are named, number one, but two, they each share some form of family system or background. They come from a similar set of backgrounds, whether it be universities, hacking groups, forums, not unlike us. And what you also note is some of the language that comes out in the indictment identifies people as personal friends or acquaintances or associates, suggesting maybe a working relationship versus I know this person outside of work. And as you evaluate some of these, you start to spot maybe the actor on the far left, he knows web shells. He knows how to hack web servers, things like that. A couple of malware developers in the mix. And so you see that maybe the malware group or the development group is tightly integrated with the operators a little bit more than maybe you would see otherwise. And what's not really illuminated in this view of the picture, rather, of the group is this gentleman in the middle was spotted, the Merv, I call him Merv. He was spotted in forums in 2012 responding to what amounted to a work order that suggested that somebody was looking for full scope penetration testing, looking for to fill 5 vacancies. And people would get paid, they would live in an apartment, and they would earn more money than they could earn anywhere else in a single month if they completed their objectives. Within a month, the Department of Justice had him and his C2 active in this activity set. The thing that you also start to illuminate as you read these indictments, this is peering under the hood a little bit more, is that it's not just one activity group. They travel in some form of circles, which is interesting. And interesting only in the fact of understanding what we ourselves collectively identify as an activity group. Many will focus strictly on just the TTPs that are observed or observable. That's totally appropriate. This, however, gives you a different sense of maybe the self-organizing nature of a threat group. Respond to a job offer, any 5 people can fill those vacancies as long as they are qualified. Voila, you have a new activity group, but it may be comprised of the exact same people. So the composition of that team may dictate the TTPs that you can observe. So for example, the web operator that I highlighted before wasn't originally a part of this group. He was called as a personal favor. He was asked to come help break into a web server and deploy some malware for the other operators. So he was an add-on. So if you were strictly looking at that group, you might actually start to break it into two now, because you see different characteristics of them on the wire. But it doesn't stop there. There's a human element to this. So here you start to see human-enabled cyber and joint operations between the physical and the cyber worlds, where the Ministry of State Security up at the top, this is who was behind the scenes, so this is your command and control unit. A number of directors, section chiefs, what have you, running the HUMINT operation. And the HUMINT operation really consisted, in this indictment at least, of 2 individuals that were named. If you combine a number of the other indictments, you will see that this web actually grows pretty tremendously. But of pointed interest as it relates to the who versus the how conversation, sometimes the who illuminates the how. And so if you look at the human activity set, you can understand that they co-opted or coerced an IT or security manager to run part of the operation. His single task was to report on the response effort. So how many people actually have an insider whose single job it is to report on your activities in your threat model? It's an interesting question, but I doubt that many people have considered that as an option. Another person, this lower individual, is a product manager at a China branch whose job it was to insert things into computers that contained proprietary malware at the time to this group. So in country, you have employees who are at risk of co-opt or coercion by an intelligence organization to increase the effectiveness of the cyber organization or the cyber unit, that operator group. And depending on how much you believe in the open source, how well researched this is, you'll find that there's also those linkages. So remember the bathtub, there's linkages, at least in public. Some of the indictments illuminate some of this too, to a couple of universities, contract units, security companies, and then so, and more. So as I was doing this, I started to evaluate, is this a pattern? So from the perspective of history, so we're going back now about 13 years, you can start to see in history this pattern is repeated. So there's almost like a template for how an operator group gets formed. Wayback Machine, Withered Rose, many people would know him if you did Dark Visitor research or anything like that in the old days. Came from a university, recruited and led a group. He was tied to some underground forums. He dropped out for 6 months to do project work that was really refining his malware and implants and technique. And eventually he was arrested for stepping out of line, or what is perceived to be stepping out of line, running DDoS for blackmail purposes, maybe to make some money on the side. There were 4 additional operators in the group, one who got kicked out for what is presumed to be bad behavior. There's a little bit of squishiness around that. Nobody knows for sure, at least that I'm aware of. And then you see a very similar individual down at the bottom who is a close personal friend of the lead operator who is also the malware developer. Now, it's not to suggest that these are equal or connected, more so that there's a template for how these organizations and groups come together to operate and run their individual sets of operations against victim companies or target companies. Now, I know you're probably thinking, Blage, why did you invite this crazy person to come here and talk about all this stuff that doesn't matter? I would posit that it does matter, but it truly will depend on who your customer are and what your network looks like. And so when we think about that, put their operational capabilities in that target box in a target-centric methodology. How do you begin to target these capabilities to defend yourself? First things first, know your network. Who is a part of your network? In a tactical and operational sense, you probably have a couple of teams. Maybe you work with them, maybe you don't on an active basis, but this is probably who should be in your network, or at least peripherally in your network. At a tactical and operational level, you probably have your SOC, your CERT, your architecture group, your compliance group, your risk group. Your red team is actually part of your network. Vulnerability management team, patch management, whatever you call them in your organization. Maybe your physical security folks who do your investigations of humans. And then obviously your threat intelligence group. On the right-hand side, the folks that are maybe more interested in the higher order of the information. In an operational, maybe strategic level, you probably have your business teams, your leadership, maybe your legal HR teams, and even into your supply chain. The key here, as we've learned this over the past several years of doing it, is that you have to learn and use a common language. So some people send around attack, some use diamond model, some use kill chain, some use all three. Some come up with their own language. That's perfectly okay, but the key is to have a common bond that you can communicate with between all of these different parts of the organization. It does no good if you're all speaking past each other. Your customer and their needs. Well, who is your customer? If you are a red team, your customer is everybody not the red team on this map, right? If you are the Intel team, the same. And on and on and on. It takes this grouping of operational teams inside of an organization to defend it effectively. No one team can do this on their own. But the trick here is actually treating each other like customers as opposed to just noisy team members that you can tend to ignore. But I've also started to identify a couple of needs of each of the customers. Now, I'm not going to identify their problems because every company has different sets of problems. Maybe you're an industrial organization, maybe you're in aviation, maybe you are a healthcare organization. Your problems and needs will vary to a degree between the type of organization you are. But that said, generally speaking, you can estimate that your teams inside your organization need these bits of information from you. And that's typically what you might try to exchange between the different parts. Word of caution, that intelligence is only actionable if there's a process and a capability to consume it, and that part of the organization knows how to act on that information. That is actionable intelligence in a nutshell. So when you hear that, when people ask you for that type of information, one of the key discriminators is to ask them if they know how to consume the information, number one, and know what actions they can take. If they don't, then there's probably a discussion to have. Two, you maybe want to reconsider the output of your team and where you're trying to direct it, and whether or not it's really worth the effort. So to that end, if you start with the 4 that I have not crossed off, you're probably in a very good place, which leads to the focus on the how, not the who. Because these teams need the how type information to defend an organization. So, one thing that we've learned also over time is that defenders carry a lot of hubris with them, a lot of confidence in what they do. Whether it is the belief that we have everything covered, that we know enough about our adversary, that we know enough about ourselves to say that yes, we can defend it. We can defend ourselves, we can defend our company, we can defend our customers. If you look at any set or series of public disclosures, breaches, any sort of notification that's occurred in the media, the blue team probably doesn't have everything covered. So we start with an evaluation of how much do you know? Now, this leads into some form of vanity metric, typically, some count of something. But really, that blue team will take a look at that and say, yep, we're good, if you ask them. Probably on the first cut. We've got you covered. It takes a real candid organization to admit that they don't have things covered. But typically, the more you dig in on that, you'll find this type of patterning within any kind of intelligence organization inside of a company or a SOC cert, anything to that effect. Because really, if we're all consuming from the same intelligence providers, which many of us are, you'll find that there's this corpus in the middle. That's usually around the delivery phases or all the way into installation, maybe a little bit into command and control. That would be number 6 there. But really, when you consume intelligence from an external organization, you're really getting that middle. So it almost becomes a bell curve, some normal curve here. Excuse me. And the tails become the most difficult parts to achieve insight into. So on the left-hand side, it's actually extremely difficult. It takes a very focused effort. It's probably not necessarily worth the time of most organizations to do recon detection, not just scans, but the actual targeting exercises and document retrieval that an actor might use against you. And on the right-hand side, that information typically comes from compromises, typically shared by people who ride around in cars with each other, or go to super secret squirrel meetings and they do secret handshakes and they exchange some bits of information in private. Unfortunately, a lot of that information never makes it out into the public, and it never makes it into your intelligence feed either. And so what does this mapping kind of look like in reality, most likely? Well, if you break that down, if you have a real candid organization. Now, this is a mapping against those indictments. So these are TTPs extracted from that set of indictments for this set of actors that I talked about before. So here we talk about the how. So you've got a couple of major methods of delivery. Phishing, passive web, so your strategic web compromises. Scan and exploit, so scanning a web server from the outside in or some application server from the outside in, and then launching an exploit against it. Human-enabled cyber, really amounting to getting somebody to take an action for you, whether that's plugging something in, clicking something to that effect. And the third-party or supply chain attack. And then off to the right, you see the rest of them. And off to the far right, you see the things that will never fit into an attack map, or at least that currently do not fit into an attack map. So these would be left off of anybody's modeling for the most part. That would be co-opting an insider. Probably not sitting in an attack model or framework today. Not that it shouldn't. Maybe there's room to grow here for the community. That's how I would see that, really an opportunity to look at outside of just the pure cyber realm and into where human and cyber blend together. And as a team evaluates these, again, you'll find that there's notable gaps on the bottom. And I'm being generous with the top here, most likely, for the bulk of organizations that I would come across in any kind of exchange. So how do we work these things together? These are 10 critical questions that I've developed over the past several years of doing this, that I've used for developing a hunting methodology that I train people on, that I work teams through. So if you take one of those capabilities or TTPs and you throw it into this and you start to ask a series of questions, a single focal point or objective, just to give you an example, a couple years ago we did one on PowerShell. When we asked the second question, we ended up with, I think it was 67 pages of raw material to weed through, to then get into the next sets of questions. So that collection effort was actually quite massive to understand how actors were using PowerShell. Not just that they were using it, but how. And then walking down through that list of questions down into, can I identify it? What conditions must be met for this to work in the given environment? If I can identify it, can I defeat it? So preying and playing onto the other parts of your organization and your network that are responsible for blocking and tackling or prevention and protection against threats or sets of activities. Maybe that's your control group, your architecture group, things like that. And second order effect and second, third order thinking. If I do end up blocking it, what are they going to bring the next time? And then finally, how do I get this into production? So a series of 10 questions that can be repeated and be handed off to your teams and worked through every single time as a mode of operation, or really just to deliver a framework to the team to consider how to combat a threat or really target their capabilities. Enter the red team. So we talked about that capability map and the fact that KC7 is usually a blank spot on just about every TTP map and or capability map for defense, unless you've been through a series of intrusions. The red team actually gives you the ability to gain insight into how this might operate or function in your environment. So it's no longer blue against red. It can't be. How do we use a red team? Well, we use them to actually curate our own offensive mindset. So if we have to get aggressive, I have to understand how a threat might actually operate in my environment. It will largely be unique per target and even per ecosystem. Your enterprise is not the same as your cloud property. A threat actor operating in one might look very different than the same threat actor operating in another. And between those two properties and a different target, they will look entirely different. So the red team provides a threat to target insight as it pertains to your organization alone. Red team is actually an intelligence function if you view it in a different lens. So they can operate as a collector and a processor of information. They go out, they run an operation, they bring back results and findings that are then analyzed by your other teams that are brought to good effect on the target, especially if your target is maybe an asset or technology in your environment. They can provide some form of capability evaluation of your blue team. They are solid advocates for your blue team. I think Tim Malcolmvetter mentioned this in a Blue Hat talk. A red team with a customer can actually advocate on behalf of the blue team to give the blue team the visibility that it needs. So I break in, I do bad things to you as the threat, I emulate that activity set, and I suggest that, well, you weren't able to detect it, maybe you need to give the blue team visibility into that. And then finally, they are an educator. They are one of the penultimate educators of an organization, but there's some magic to be had there. The red team actually has to be very, very well positioned, I would say, to gain access to the right portions of the organization to deliver that educational message to the right teams. Maybe that's your network team, maybe that's your leadership. There's a wide variety of customers inside of an environment that a red team has to interact with, which again points me back to them actually looking and feeling a lot like an intelligence team. So if you're a red team, communicate with your intelligence team, learn from them, share with them on how they communicate, because the two parts of the organization there actually have to communicate in a very similar fashion. When a red team partners with the blue team, what do they get in return? Understanding of their attack tools and their artifacts. So I always say, hey, red team, here's access to my Splunk environment or whatever my log aggregation tool is, my SIM. Come find yourself. Look and evaluate how you actually are manifesting in this environment. You know, I gave an example a couple of years ago here related to Cobalt Strike. Changed my red team's perspective on how they're using that tool and maybe the motives and the TTPs that they're actually using. So as a result of that, you start to get some new inspiration for changing your TTPs, and you also get calibration of that. So by partnering together, you can actually calibrate, am I acting too much like a red team, or am I close enough to what a threat actor might do? If I'm off running some TTPs that has never been seen by a threat actor, or never been used, rather, by a threat actor, maybe you're a little far off the reservation. We need to bring you back into the fold a little bit and recalibrate. Recommendations. Typically, a red team can struggle with writing good, solid recommendations. So if we pair those together with a blue team, you can drive those recommendations together. You get some improved sharing and metrics. So blue teams typically have some form of capability and growth measurement of their operators, of their teams. Some people might call this the moral equivalent of weapons qualifications. Maybe you need to look at, from a red team perspective, what your members are qualified to execute and what they're not, so that they can grow. In addition to that, you can form mutual metrics with your blue team. Some quick do's and don'ts. Some do's. Give the red team some meaningful targets and don't waste their talent. So red team really likes to be artists. So don't bind them into a very small box that says, I need you to emulate actor X, and you can only use actor X's specific TTPs. Give them some room to breathe, because recognize one simple truth, and that is that an APT actor is a human being, and he's creative and a sentient being. He will not always present and project the exact same way from incursion to incursion, especially over time. So while you want to cover down on a broad-based tactic or technique, there's a lot of room inside of each of those to allow freedom of movement for your red team. Ensure that you're holding them accountable to debrief their findings to anybody and everybody who's responsible for some set of actions related to those findings. Do write your detection for a blue team for their behaviors, but do not specifically try to actually find your red team. If you are off writing specific IOC-based detection for your red team, I'm going to suggest that maybe you need to rethink your strategy and your approach and how you're actually defending your environment. Because red team is not your adversary. They're there to emulate your adversary. Invite them into IR and hunt efforts. One of my fantastic, greatest experiences with the red team was I brought them into a response effort and I showed them commands that an operator was running. And they looked at that and said, Aaron, there's 2 operators there. And I looked at it and I said, how'd you know that? Well, their insight into how their operation ran and how quickly and effectively they run commands, plus evaluation of what those specific commands were, suggested to that red team operator that there were 2 distinct actors inside the same computer at the same time using 2 different C2s. So really tremendous opportunity to not only bring them into your response efforts, but also into a hunting effort to help you with detection, development, emulation exercises. And finally, don't let them run the same TTPs for 6 months. And red teamers, if you are executing the same TTPs for 6, 12 months, please stop, come up for air. You're probably not helping your organization if you're doing that. Because whatever you're doing is clearly working, especially if nobody's detecting you, and your organization actually needs to adapt to those TTPs to cover down. Words of warning, and 2 things that I think are probably the most important as it relates to a red team, and the blue team interaction. One is this mantra of it's just the red team. How do you know if you're a blue team? Maybe there are specific TTPs that are exercised by a red teamer. Maybe not. But don't discard what they do. They're actually a defender just like you. And the blame culture. Removing a blame culture that exists, that the red team is there to beat the blue team, that if you don't find them, you're failing, and vice versa. If I caught you, you're failing. The blame culture exists in both directions and needs to be countered effectively. So every time you see this in your environment, in your organization, seek to squash this flat. Now, when we get to process confidence, development of what it means to actually blue team an environment or defend an environment, your process maybe looks something like this. You have an intelligence team. Maybe they do some collection. They throw it into an intel platform. Maybe they form hypotheses if it's behavior. They shove that over to a detection team or function. That function actually executes and runs through all the TTPs, runs through test deployment, pushes it into sensors and platforms. And on the other end of that, you have a responder. And that responder is responsible for running triage and the actual response effort itself. And maybe you have a hunt team or hunt function also buried down in your organization. But what I'm going to offer here is really, how do you know it's all working all the time? When you actually dig in, ask yourself some really critical questions. What's your defect rate on endpoint sensors in your environment? Odds are you're probably at 80% effectiveness on your endpoints. How about your data platforms? How well or how reliable is that data feed coming in? How well structured is that information? How usable is it? There are many, many gotchas in any single set of processes that your team might run that require really, really super close evaluation to know that you have confidence in the execution of your process time in and time out. Red teams and blue teams have their own sets of processes that they run in cycles. They can run this together. You can run a red team through the blue team process and see and use that as a gauge or an evaluation period for your team to know where your periods of slowdown are and where you're fast enough so that you can actually start to prioritize process modification. Process speed. So we take CrowdStrike, threat actor breakout time. This is a time from entry to lateral movement by country according to their evaluation. And then we take Mandiant's dwell time on the right-hand side from their M-Trends reporting. A defender typically has a 101-day median dwell time. That means from the time somebody enters into your environment, you're not going to detect it, which means your process does not start until day 101, 102. And if you're receiving external notification from an agency, you're probably 3, maybe 4 months out from the time of entry. And from that point, that's where your process actually starts. So when we talk about speed, does your speed match parity with, or does it even come close to the speed of a threat actor from that point of privilege escalation or pivoting or lateral movement? Now you have something to work against. You have a target. You can take your process and target it towards your threat actor. And this is just a gauge or a guide to give you a basic level of expectation for what you have to cover down on. And you can actually work your processes to close that gap as much as possible. Now, before I get into this, I just want to give a quick shout out to a couple of people who have done some really tremendous work in this space. I am super excited to see what's out there. I think Rodrigo's here, if I'm not mistaken. A couple of the other guys maybe are not. But the Dragos team, I think Joe's probably here, if I'm not mistaken as well. So a big shout out to the 4 folks there that run these projects or have written these papers on this topic. This is super, super critical. In any given environment, there are 5 defensive elements that center around these categorical areas of endpoint, network, identity, application, and data. An actor needs to actually secure or gain entrance into some form of all 5 of these if their, let's say, objective is to steal that information or steal intellectual property, something to that effect. And so evaluation of these needs to be run against each ecosystem for each target using each of those defensive elements. So if there's any way to merge some of these projects, guys, I would encourage everybody who's a participant in this space, merge these kind of concepts together. There's maybe room for a framework that describes multiple different forms of coverage and coverage confidence. And ecosystem visibility, as it relates to each ecosystem, you have maybe a matrix, right? Endpoints talking to endpoints, endpoints in isolation, the relationship between an identity and a network, such and such, as you see the different points here. Each one of these represents maybe the form of a micro-perimeter, where perimeters offer you a position of visibility. So as it relates to each of those ecosystems on the right-hand side, you can evaluate your points of visibility. And a word of caution, typically this is what you'll see in organizations, that we focus very, very heavily on endpoint and network. And moving forward in time, those two become less and less important. And maybe you'll see more in the identity and application space as it relates to, let's say, a cloud environment or other serverless type environments where networks and endpoints don't truly exist. So consider where you place on that matrix. Let me speed up here, guys. Actually, sorry. Simplified workbook. So again, I'm not going to repeat what other folks have done in this space, but here's maybe a different view of it, a different way to consider it, different concept. That if you take a NIST framework and those defensive elements against your targets, you can evaluate them thusly. So do I have collection? Do I have detection? Do I know how to respond? That would map nicely to your compliance folks, maybe your risk folks as well. And you can assign a simple scoring system or a complex scoring system. The scoring system itself is not the point here, only that you actually develop one. So the folks that I mentioned before have a series of scoring systems that they've discussed in public. So with that in mind, look to combine and create maybe a best of breed option here between these examples. So in closing, we started off talking about good versus evil. Just remember, towards the end of Star Wars, the evil guy woke up and threw the super bad guy into the tunnel, and he exploded, only to come back, right? As we look ahead to the next Star Wars, it's anticipated that he will come back. Well, your threat actors will come back too. So that partnership between red and blue must exist. Seek to close any gaps that exist in your organization as it relates to those two parts of the organization together. Bring them together. And in final thoughts, look, consider your perspectives, derive new insight. You know, are you the butt with the wig? Or are you seeing a big picture? Focus on your targets and satisfying the needs of your network. Evaluate the who versus how and understand the relationship and where to draw the line before you go down the rabbit hole of evaluating the who for the sake of evaluating the who. It's a pitfall for almost every intelligence team as it relates to attribution. If you're a blue team or a defensive organization, be candid about your capabilities. It satisfies nobody and it helps no one, really, if you are untruthful about the actual capabilities that you have. And learn to partner with your red teams. And let me leave you with two final thoughts. One, somebody will be out there trying to steal and drink your water, especially if you are too busy arguing over the state of it. So again, put the arguments aside and remember that you're up against a threat actor that you have in common. You both work for the same organization, most likely, or you're contracting for a customer, and therefore you're serving that customer. And in final thoughts now, what I'll give you is a story. A couple days ago, I was at a coffee shop, and I walked up unaware of everything going on, and the barista said, here's the coffee that you ordered, and said, no charge. I thought, wait a minute, no charge? How did that happen? I'm here, I've got my money. And they said, well, this person over here paid for you, and they took care of it for you. So that, for me, was a life lesson. It's happened a couple times. I try to give back every time that this occurs, and then on my own. But really, we have a next generation following us. We are all part of the same generation doing this type of work. Buy somebody else a coffee, share their story, hear their story, grow together, and work together because we both and we all have a common thread, and that thread that binds us is our threat. We are here to defend against our threat actors, and we do that together. So, thank you. Have a great conference.